In the dusty heart of forgotten lands, where shadows stretched long and justice bent to the will of men, a woman dared to save a life, only to find her own hanging by a thread. A rich cowboy's last breath, snatched from the jaws of death, yet the very act that brought him back would condemn her to the gallows. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind, a cruel, relentless sculptor, had etched the very landscape of Blackwood Gulch with sorrow. It whistled through the skeletal remains of forgotten homesteads and whispered secrets into the parched earth, a perpetual lament for lives crushed under the weight of an unforgiving frontier. Elara knew this lament well. It was the soundtrack to her solitude, a constant, mournful hum against the backdrop of a town that saw her as little more than a phantom, an unwelcome whisper. Her small, unassuming cabin, nestled on the ragged fringes where the last scrub pines clung desperately to life, was her sanctuary, her cage. She moved through the world with a quiet grace, her hands calloused not from idleness, but from a lifetime of coaxing life from barren soil and mending broken things. She carried the weight of unspoken stories in her eyes, a deep, unsettling blue that mirrored the twilight sky just before a storm. These were the eyes of a survivor, but also the eyes of someone perpetually on the edge, braced for the next blow. One sweltering afternoon, a sound ripped through the oppressive silence, tearing at the fabric of the peace she had so carefully woven around herself. A horse, riderless, galloped madly towards the gulch, its bridle snapping, foam flecking its flanks. Close behind, a faint, ragged scream, swallowed almost immediately by the wind, yet unmistakable. Elara's breath hitched. She knew that sound. It was the frantic cry of a man caught in the teeth of a merciless land. Her instincts, honed by years of living where life was cheap and death a constant companion, propelled her forward. She didn't hesitate, didn't weigh the risks, didn't calculate the town's inevitable judgment. She moved, a blur of faded calico against the pale dust. Her mind, a singular, urgent focus. A life was in peril. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of the frontier, where humanity, stripped of its veneer, sometimes shone through the darkest cracks. She didn't seek gratitude, only to quell the insistent drumbeat of her own conscience. The air shimmered with the heat, a silent, oppressive blanket, but Elara paid it no mind. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, churning dust cloud, the source of that desperate sound. It wasn't just a man, it was a valuable man. She recognized the distinctive, polished leather and silver trappings that marked the rider as one of the affluent cattle barons, a man whose wealth had transformed him from a mere cowboy into a figure of distant, almost mythical power in the eyes of Blackwood Gulch. Even from this distance, she could discern the fine stitching on his saddle, the glint of expensive spurs. He was Abraham Thorne, a name whispered with reverence and a touch of envy in the town. A man whose vast ranches stretched across horizons few Blackwood residents had ever seen. He was caught, not in a tangle of barbed wire or a skirmish with rustlers, but in the treacherous embrace of the Quick Creek, a deceptively placid waterway that, after the rare, violent spring rains, swelled into a churning, unpredictable torrent. The creek, usually a gentle ribbon of silver, was a roaring beast now, its waters the color of rust and fury, dragging loose branches and debris in its relentless current. Thorne's horse, thrown by the unexpected surge, had bucked him into the treacherous depths, and he was clearly injured, struggling against the powerful undertow, his expensive hat long gone, his face a mask of terror. Other men, cowboys from his outfit, stood helplessly on the bank, shouting ineffectual warnings, paralyzed by the sheer power of the water and perhaps by the unspoken fear of losing such a vital figure. They were good men, in their way, but their actions were bound by custom, by fear, by a rigid code of conduct that sometimes demanded inaction when boldness was truly needed. Their collective fear, a palpable thing, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to Elara's grim determination. Without a second thought, Elara plunged into the raging current. The water was shockingly cold, a visceral shock that stole her breath, but she pushed through it, her movements fluid and purposeful, honed by years of navigating treacherous waters and dangerous situations. She didn't possess the brute strength of a man, but she had an uncanny understanding of the river's moods, a silent communion forged over countless hours spent by its banks. She battled the current, her strong, calloused hands reaching, grasping, finally latching onto Thorn's flailing arm. He was heavier than she anticipated, a dead weight compounded by the water's pull, but her resolve was absolute. She tugged, pulling him against the powerful flow, not towards the helpless cowboys on the bank, but towards a cluster of gnarled willow roots, thick and strong, that offered a precarious purchase further downstream. It was a risky gamble, a desperate maneuver, but it was their only chance. With a final gargantuan effort, Alara managed to haul Thorn onto the muddy bank, depositing him beside the twisted roots. He lay there, gasping, coughing up murky water, a ragged mess of damp tweed and shock, his face ashen. She watched him, her own lungs burning, the cold of the river still clinging to her skin, a persistent shiver that had nothing to do with the sun's relentless heat. The cowboys, now galvanized by the sudden cessation of their master's struggle, splashed across the shallower parts of the creek, their faces a mixture of relief and bewildered confusion. They rushed to Thorn, offering reassurances, checking for injuries, their attention wholly absorbed by their employer. None of them, not one, spared a glance for the sodden woman who had just plucked their boss from the maw of the river. It was as if she were part of the landscape, an extension of the rugged terrain, irrelevant once her task was complete. Thorn, slowly recovering, managed a weak cough, his eyes fluttering open. He saw Alara, still kneeling beside him, her gaze unwavering. A flicker of something passed through his eyes, gratitude perhaps, quickly followed by a flash of something else, something harder to decipher, something akin to surprise, even suspicion. He was a man accustomed to being in control, to commanding his destiny, and the sight of this solitary woman, the notorious Gulch Witch, as some whispered, having saved him, unsettled the very core of his well-ordered world. His gaze lingered for a moment, an uncomfortable, searching scrutiny that made Alara's skin prickle. Then, he turned away, directing his attention to his anxious men, issuing terse, almost clipped commands. He seemed to dismiss her, to erase her from the immediate landscape, just as the town had largely erased her from its collective consciousness. The incident spread through Blackwood Gulch like a brush fire across dry prairie grass, twisting and distorting with each telling. News traveled fast in a town starved for excitement, but the truth, like clean water in a drought, was often scarce. The initial relief that Abraham Thorn, the pillar of their struggling economy, was safe, quickly soured. Whispers began, insidious and persistent, coiling around Alara's name. Why was she there? How did she know? What was she doing so close to Thorn's grazing lands? The undertone was always the same. Suspicion. She was an outsider, a woman who lived by her own rules, untamed by the rigid social strictures of the town. She didn't attend church. She didn't join the quilting bees. She didn't smile when the men rode past. This independence, this quiet defiance of expectation, bred resentment, and resentment, like a hungry wolf, always seeks an easy prey. The very act of saving a life, an act that should have earned her reverence, became a twisted testament to her otherness. The days that followed were thick with an unspoken dread. The air in Blackwood Gulch grew heavy, suffocating, not with dust, but with the palpable weight of suspicion. Children, once curious, now darted away when Alara's shadow fell near. Women averted their eyes, their gazes hardening, their lips pressed into thin, disapproving lines. The men, gathered at the saloon or the general store, lowered their voices when she passed, their laughter dying in their throats, replaced by a tense silence, punctuated by the clinking of spurs and the creak of leather. She felt their eyes, hundreds of unseen pinpricks against her skin, each one a needle of judgment. The town's collective unconscious, a tapestry woven from fear and narrow-mindedness, began to unravel, exposing the ugly threads of prejudice that lay beneath. It was a familiar pattern, one she had seen woven before, in other places, by other fearful hands. Her mind, an old, worn book, flipped back to a page she rarely revisited, a faded memory from years ago, a time when her name wasn't Ilara, but something softer, more hopeful. The image was of a young girl, no older than 10, standing beside a river, not unlike Quick Creek, but clearer, colder, fed by mountain snowmelt. Her father, a man whose hands had always been as gentle as his words, was teaching her to read the currents, to understand the river's deceptive whispers. "The water can give," he had said, his voice a low rumble, "and the water can take. It judges no man, child, only responds to what it is. Learn its nature, and you will fear nothing." He had been a trapper, a solitary man who lived on the edges of society, much like herself now, but without the invisible shroud of collective condemnation. He had taught her resilience, taught her to rely on herself, to see the world not through the clouded lens of human judgment, but with the clear, unblinking eye of nature. This was the source of her skills, the wellspring of her quiet power, a power so misunderstood by those who feared what they could not control. But that peaceful memory was quickly shattered by the harsher, more immediate one. The day her father, caught in a territorial dispute with a band of rough prospectors, had vanished into the very wilderness he revered, leaving her utterly alone. She had been 13, barely more than a child, but the experience had forged her, hardened her into the woman she became. It was then she learned the true cruelty of men, their capacity for violence when their greed or fear was stoked. She had watched, hidden in the brush, as the prospectors, eyes alight with a possessive fury, searched for her father, their threats echoing through the pines. She had survived by becoming invisible, by adopting the quiet strength of the wilderness itself. This ability to navigate the dangerous currents of life, both literal and metaphorical, was what Blackwood Gulch, with its rigid conventions and fear of the unknown, simply could not comprehend. It was this inability to understand her unconventional past, her self-reliance, that fueled their escalating suspicion. The quiet tension festered, turning rancid like stagnant water. It was Marshal Silas Croft, a man whose spine was as rigid as the town's outdated moral code, who finally gave it voice. He stood on the dusty steps of the general store, his broad-brimmed hat casting his face into shadow, his silver star gleaming dully in the harsh afternoon light. Around him, a crowd had swelled, drawn by the scent of impending drama, their faces a grim tableau of curiosity and righteous indignation. Old Man Hemlock, his eyes rheumy with age and suspicion, was there, muttering about outsiders bringing trouble. Mrs. Gable, her hands perpetually clasped over her apron, whispered about unnatural women. The barber, the blacksmith, the saloon keeper, they were all there, a collective entity, a single, judgmental eye fixed upon Alara. Croft's voice, when it came, was a slow, deliberate drawl, cutting through the murmuring crowd like a blunted knife. "Ilara," he stated, his tone devoid of warmth. "The folks here in Blackwood Gulch, they got questions, serious questions." Her name, once merely a sound, now hung in the air, heavy with accusation, a whispered condemnation. She stood before them, a lone figure against the collective weight of their judgment, her shoulders straight, her gaze meeting theirs without flinching. Her hands, usually so busy, hung loosely at her sides, but within her a fierce current raged. She had faced down wolves in the wilderness, but this mob, with their self-righteous certainty, felt far more dangerous. The accusation, when it finally emerged, was a blunt, ugly thing. "Some are saying," Croft continued, his voice gaining a hard edge, "that you knew Abraham Thorne was going to be in trouble, that you were waiting, that perhaps you were even responsible for his predicament, hoping to gain favor, or worse, to profit from his wealth." A gasp rippled through the crowd, a collective intake of breath that fueled the fire of their suspicion. The sheer audacity of the claim was stunning, a testament to the depths of their prejudice. She had saved a life, risking her own, and this was the twisted truth they manufactured? The irony of it, a bitter, acrid taste, filled her mouth. Thorne, the man she had pulled from the river, was wealthy. That was his sin in their eyes, and by extension, her supposed desire for it, her assumed manipulation of his distress, became hers. Alara's eyes, usually so guarded, flashed. "I saved his life," she stated, her voice quiet but ringing with an undeniable truth. "From the river, nothing more, nothing less. But her words, simple and direct, were swallowed by the rising tide of their distrust. The narrative had already been written in their minds, etched in the hardened lines of their faces. The fact that she had performed an extraordinary feat, one no one else dared attempt, only served to deepen their suspicion. It was unfathomable to them that a woman like her, an outcast, could possess such courage without a hidden, nefarious motive. The rich cowboy, now recovered, remained silent, a distant, unsettling presence, his tacit non-intervention an unspoken confirmation of their worst fears. The threat of the hanging, a chilling premonition, began to solidify, no longer just a whisper, but a palpable presence in the choking dust of the street. The small dark cell in the Blackwood Gulch jail was nothing more than 4 rough-hewn walls and a single barred window that offered a sliver of the fading, mocking sunlight. It smelled of stale dust, forgotten fear, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Alara sat on the hard cot, her back pressed against the cold stone, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the town, each murmur a reminder of her confinement, her impending doom. The accusations, venomous and baseless, echoed in the hollow space of her mind, a relentless drumbeat. They called her a witch, a schemer, a heartless opportunist. They saw only what they wanted to see, a distorted reflection of their own fears and prejudices. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. She had risked her own life to save a man they revered, and in return, they offered her a noose. Her gaze drifted to the small patch of sky visible through the bars, a deepening indigo bruised with the coming night. A memory, long buried beneath layers of self-preservation, surfaced, unwelcome but insistent. It was a moonless night, years ago, when she was barely past girlhood. She saw herself, a blur of panicked movement, crouched behind a pile of abandoned crates in a desolate, forgotten corner of a sprawling frontier town. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird desperate to escape its cage. A man, a gambler with a cruel laugh and even crueler hands, had accused her of cheating him, a false charge fueled by liquor and a string of bad luck. He had pursued her through the shadowed alleys, his threats like predatory snarls. She remembered the sheer terror, the cold dread that seeped into her bones, the frantic scramble to survive, to escape the brutal, arbitrary justice of a vengeful man. She had managed to slip away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind not just the town, but also the last vestiges of her youthful naivety. That night, she had learned the chilling truth. Innocence offered no shield against malice, and often, the only defense was to simply disappear. The flawed woman they now saw, the one who lived on the margins, was a creation of survival, a shell built to withstand the relentless battering of a world that offered little mercy. She had learned to be invisible, to be self-sufficient, to not ask for help, because every interaction with the world outside her solitary existence had, in some way, led to pain or misunderstanding. The town's current condemnation was merely another chapter in this brutal story, another instance where her very existence, her unconventional strength, was perceived as a threat. The bars of the cell, cold and unyielding, felt like the culmination of a lifetime of being judged, of being misunderstood, of being an outsider looking in, always looking in. The morning air, usually crisp and clean, felt thick with anticipation, heavy with the stench of fear and the oppressive weight of collective judgment. They didn't bother with a formal trial, not really. This was Blackwood Gulch, not a civilized courthouse. The proceedings were a grim farce, played out beneath the merciless gaze of the rising sun. A makeshift gallows, hastily erected near the edge of town, stood stark against the pale sky, its rough-hewn timber a brutal monument to their intentions. The entire town seemed to have turned out, a silent, unblinking congregation, their faces etched with a grim satisfaction, a perverse sense of communal justice. They spoke in hushed tones, but their collective silence, their unwavering stares, screamed volumes. Alara stood before them, her hands bound, her eyes scanning the sea of faces, searching for a flicker of doubt, a shadow of compassion. There was none, only hardened resolve, the kind born of fear and self-preservation, the rigid righteousness of a mob, convinced of its own virtue. Marshall Croft, a stoic figure, stood beside the gallows, his voice devoid of emotion as he read from a tattered ledger, a litany of charges as flimsy as a spiderweb. For the endangerment of Abraham Thorne, he droned. For the unlawful attempt to extract wealth through manipulation, and for the practice of ungodly arts. The last charge hung in the air, a poisonous vapor, drawing gasps from the more fervent members of the crowd. It was the whisper that had gathered strength, the one that turned a woman of competence into a figure of dark magic. Ilara felt a surge of bitter amusement, a strange, dark irony twisting in her gut. Ungodly arts. Was saving a life ungodly? Was understanding the river's treacherous currents a pact with the devil? Sparse but impactful words were spoken from the crowd, sharp as thrown stones. "She's an outcast," one woman hissed, her voice cutting through the thick air. "Always has been, always will be." Another, a burly rancher, spat. "She don't belong here. Never did." Their words, devoid of nuance, served only to reinforce the prevailing sentiment, to solidify the collective delusion. There was no defense offered, no witnesses called on her behalf, no room for dissent in this court of public opinion. Abraham Thorne was present, a silent, imposing figure on horseback, observing the spectacle from a slight distance, his face unreadable. His silence was a roar, a tacit approval that condemned her more surely than any shouted accusation. It was the definitive proof, for the town, that their judgment was just. The rope, thick and new, hung ominously from the crossbeam, a silent promise of oblivion, the ultimate manifestation of their fear-driven justice. The air crackled with a brittle stillness, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. Ilara was led forward, the rough hands of deputies pushing her towards the gallows. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance, a silent protest against the crushing weight of their prejudice. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum in her chest, but her face remained a mask of quiet resolve. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not allow her spirit, honed by years of struggle, to shatter before their unforgiving eyes. The world narrowed to the rough texture of the rope, the smell of fresh-cut pine, the expectant, hungry faces of the crowd. The sun, now high in the sky, beat down relentlessly, a fiery eye observing the cruel ritual. Marshal Croft, his face a grim mask, adjusted the noose. The sudden sharp scent of hemp filled her nostrils, a sickening odor that screamed of finality. A single fly buzzed lazily around her head, a small, insignificant life in the face of so much human cruelty. In that agonizing moment, a lifetime of memories flashed through her mind, not as a jumbled chaos, but as distinct, vivid images. The gentle touch of her father's hand, the quiet solitude of her cabin, the fierce joy of outwitting the wild, and then the image of Abraham Thorne, gasping for breath, his face pale and contorted with fear, his hand reaching for hers in the swirling current. She had saved him. She had given him a future. And now, this was her reward. The bitter irony twisted her gut, a coil of nausea. Then, just as the noose settled, tight and chafing against her neck, a voice, deep and resonant, sliced through the stifling silence. It was Abraham Thorne. He spurred his horse forward, breaking the silent, expectant circle of the townspeople. His gaze fixed on Ilara. His face, usually unreadable, was now etched with a profound conflict, a battle waged in the depths of his own conscience. "Hold," he commanded, his voice echoing with an unexpected authority that stunned the crowd into submission. Every eye turned to him, the rich cowboy, the victim, whose testimony now held the power to sway the very currents of their predetermined justice. He had witnessed her selfless act, the raw, brutal truth of it. And in that moment, faced with the ultimate injustice, his wealth and status, often a barrier, became a potent tool for truth. He dismounted, his movements deliberate, his eyes meeting Ilara's point. In that deep, fleeting connection, she saw not just recognition, but something akin to shame, a nascent understanding of the terrible wrong about to be committed. His next words were quiet, but they reverberated through the stunned silence like a bell. "She saved my life, and she asked for nothing. If you hang this woman, you hang your own souls." The words hung in the air, blunt and undeniable, a direct challenge to their collective righteousness. The unspoken truth of his wealth, his prestige, lent an undeniable weight to his statement. forcing a crack in the wall of their prejudice, exposing the raw, ugly truth of their baseless accusations. A ripple of unease, a wave of discomfort began to spread through the crowd. The words hung in the oppressive air, a heavy, undeniable truth that settled upon the crowd like a shroud. Thorne's declaration, stark and uncompromising, had shattered the fragile illusion of their collective righteousness. The unity of the mob, once so absolute, began to fracture. Whispers arose, hesitant at first, then gaining momentum, like a wind-shifting direction. Faces that had been set in grim determination now showed doubt, confusion, even a flicker of shame. The collective eye of the town, previously unblinking in its judgment, now wavered, losing its focus. Marshal Croft, visibly shaken by Thorne's intervention, slowly, almost reluctantly, reached up and loosened the noose from Ilara's neck. The rough hemp, though no longer threatening, still felt like a brand against her skin, a constant reminder of how close she had come to oblivion. The deputies, their faces a mixture of relief and discomfort, untied her hands. Her wrists ached, but the physical pain was a dull throb compared to the sharp, cutting agony of the past few days. She rubbed her wrists, feeling the raw, chafed skin, a physical manifestation of the invisible shackles they had tried to impose upon her spirit. Thorne stood before the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them, silent in his condemnation of their almost act. His presence alone, the weight of his reputation and his quiet certainty, was enough. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. His mere existence, and the irrefutable fact of his rescue, spoke volumes. The town did not offer apologies. There was no public declaration of innocence, no effusive outpouring of gratitude. Blackwood Gulch was not built for such open displays of humility. Instead, there was a palpable shift in the air, a grudging, resentful acceptance. The crowd slowly, awkwardly, began to disperse, melting away like snow under a harsh sun. They couldn't admit their error, not openly, but their retreat was an acknowledgement, a quiet surrender. The lingering darkness of their prejudice still clung to the edges of the town, a stubborn residue, but the immediate threat, the chilling prospect of a life unjustly taken, had receded. Ilara stood there, unbound, watching them go. She felt no triumph, only an immense weariness. The hope that now flickered within her was a fragile, tender thing, not a blazing fire. It was the hope born of survival, not vindication. Thorne, having delivered his powerful statement, turned and mounted his horse, a fleeting glance, a silent acknowledgement, passing between them. He had done what was necessary, his conscience demanding action where others had chosen complicity. The town would remain Blackwood Gulch, a place of shadows and lingering biases. But for Ilara, the gallows, once a symbol of inevitable doom, now stood as a testament to the fragile, unpredictable nature of justice on the frontier, a place where a single voice could, at times, pierce the thick veil of collective delusion. The sun dipped below the rugged horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and dying orange, a familiar, melancholic beauty that mirrored the landscape of Ilara's soul. She walked away from the silent, empty gallows, its stark silhouette fading into the twilight, a ghost of what might have been. Her footsteps made no sound in the soft dust, a silent echo of her solitary existence. Blackwood Gulch had not changed its heart, not truly. Its prejudices remained, deeply ingrained like the veins in ancient stone. But something within its rigid structure had been shaken, a tiny crack appearing in the facade of its unwavering conviction. The rich cowboy, Abraham Thorne, had used his undeniable standing to puncture the balloon of their righteous fury. Not out of friendship, perhaps, but out of a sudden, undeniable compulsion towards truth, a moral reckoning against the raw, unvarnished injustice. She returned to her small cabin on the outskirts, a haven of quiet simplicity, its single window glowing with the soft light of a kerosene lamp. The familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs enveloped her, a comforting embrace after the brutal chaos of the day. She sat by the flickering flame, watching the shadows dance on the walls, each one a silent companion. The ordeal had stripped her bare, exposing the raw nerves of her resilience, her deep-seated fear of persecution, and her enduring, flawed humanity. She was still the same Ilara, a woman carved from the harsh realities of the frontier, scarred but not broken. The irony, a bitter and persistent companion, remained. Her selfless act had brought her to the brink of death, yet the very society that condemned her was sustained by the silent courage of individuals like her. Life on the frontier, she mused, was a constant negotiation with the land, with fate, and most perilously, with the unpredictable nature of man. It was a cycle of struggle and survival, punctuated by moments of stark beauty and searing pain. The collective memory of Blackwood Gulch might eventually soften the edges of the hanging that almost was, transforming it into a cautionary tale, a whispered legend. But for Ilara, it would remain a raw, vivid wound, a testament to the thin, fragile line between life and death, acceptance and ostracization. She knew, with a certainty born of hard-won experience, that she would forever exist on the periphery, a ghost in their midst, her existence a mirror reflecting their own fears. Yet, there was also a quiet strength, a grounded peace that settled within her. She had faced the hangman's noose and had emerged, not triumphant, not celebrated, but free. The silence of her cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, now felt like a vast open space, filled with the promise of unseen horizons. The sun would rise again, painting the sky with the same indifferent beauty, and Ilara, a flawed, complex woman, would continue to walk her solitary path, her story forever intertwined with the unforgiving heart of the Western lands, a testament to a spirit that refused to be extinguished by the darkness of human cruelty. Her existence was an open loop, a story still being written, a silent, powerful ripple in the vast, unforgiving landscape.